Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr Sophie Lieberman and I'm the Head of Programs here at Sydney Living Museums. I'm very excited to be able to welcome you to The Changing Home, the first of 8 talks that Sydney Living Museums are presenting as part of the Sydney Open Talks Rooms in the House series. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Rooms in the House series is the third in the Sydney Open Talk series, presented by Sydney Living Museums, and it brings together renowned architects, eminent historians, insightful social commentators and people with interesting opinions to explore how design and the use and relationship of different rooms in our homes has changed over time and what that tells us about who we are. The concept of rooms is actually one that's quite important to Sydney Living Museums. We own 8 house museums, and across those museums we can identify the changing ways that Australians have lived from very first contact right through to the modern period with the Seidler House which was built in 1948. And on an ongoing basis, we work with people regularly around how it is that they live. And we do that through the research that's done through the Caroline Simpson Research Library and Research Collection, but also through our public programming and our broader engagement with things like the Endangered Houses Fund. So we feel very connected to the subject, and Howard was saying before that I should be pointing out that one of the ways that this series works from his perspective, and was certainly we agree, is that by bringing 2 people from very different backgrounds or even seemingly unrelated backgrounds together to explore these different rooms over the series and the different ways that we've used rooms over the series of 8 talks, we create space for new ways of thinking about old spaces and also some kind of foundation and history for new spaces. So before I introduce the speakers and let them get on with the real business of this evening, just a couple of short housekeeping things. If you could please switch your phones to silent. If you could refrain from taking photographs or recording this event. We are actually live streaming, and there will be video of this event available afterwards, and we're very happy to provide you with access to that. And it will be up on the Sydney Living Museums website. So please, check back in with us, and if you need an update on when that's happening, let Claire Wilmot know, who's down the back there. We'd also love to hear your feedback, and we have some surveys in the bar area where you came in. If you have a few minutes on your way out, please take some time to fill them in and let us know your thoughts. So this evening, to get on with it, we will hear from Howard, Tanner and Rebecca Huntley, and they will discuss the changing home from British influence and Australian aesthetic. Both Howard and Rebecca will speak for 30 minutes and we'll have questions at the end of that, and I will do a brief introduction to each of them as they begin. So Howard, who's our first speaker this evening, is a Sydney architect and senior consultant with Tanner Kibble Denton Architects. And he has been the national president of the Australian Institute of Architects and facilitated ongoing participation in the Venice Architecture Biennale, as well as chairing the Australian Architecture Awards. In his early career, Howard established an architectural heritage and conservation courses at the University of Sydney and undertook the pioneering of the historic towns of Port Fairy, Victoria, Braidwood, New South Wales studies. In 2011-2012, he was a professorial fellow, architecture and design at the University of Canberra, which resulted in his appointment to the jury for the 2013 Ideas Competition for a new Prime Minister's residence in Canberra, which sounds very exciting. Howard is also has a long association with Sydney Living Museums and is somebody we count as a dear and old friend. He was the Foundation Board Director here for many years. And we also have to congratulate him on his new bling, which he received yesterday. He was appointed an AM in the Queen's Birthday Awards for significant service to architecture and to heritage conservation. And we are delighted to have Howard speaking this evening.
Good. Well, 2 very different talks tonight. And mine will be trying to cut through how the Sydney or the Australian house evolved. And it's quite an interesting story because people came here and they had to, in very difficult circumstances, shelter themselves. And so, in essence, they looked around for the local materials and they looked at the basic shelters of the Aborigines. And they also reflected on British rural life and various unusual and simple methods of construction like wattle and daub. Gosh, are we all right? And thatch, shingle, brick nog, which is a combination of timber and basic brickwork with a render over it, and even rammed earth. And of course, later on, corrugated iron provided a wonderful material that was easy to transport and extraordinarily versatile. And so that started to layer what they did. These are interesting pictures. The picture on the left from the very remarkable book, a recent book on Aboriginal housing. There was a view once that there wasn't such a thing, but the book rather demonstrates there was. And of course, what's interesting in the Holterman photographs from the gold rushes of the 1860s thereabout, up at Hill End and Gulgong, you see how, in fact, bark and timber is adapted by Westerners to make basic sheltering accommodation. And some of you might have seen the Holterman photographs recently down at the State Library, but amazing pictures of people making do in very primitive conditions. And so you see bark and timber on the left and the chimney on the very, very left, probably lined with sheet metal, and on the right a wattled and daub house with a roof of bark held down by timber counterweights. And so this is really the beginning of essential shelter. As I say, lessons learned often from the Aborigines. In the 19th century, you could heat a house, but my gosh, it was hard to keep it cool. And of course, it wasn't helped by the people wearing layers upon layers of heavy clothing and being respectable neck to knee. They decided that perhaps high-ceilinged houses, dark interiors, verandas, goodness, interesting wobble there, and ventilated roof spaces would help. And they got very interested in the veranda as an Indian-based idea of sheltering the walls and the exterior of the house. And they closed up the house on hot days. They had cool breezes with cross ventilation at night. And of course, they weren't all that keen on sunshine. It damaged their skin and bleached their fabrics. So the house was kept closed and dark. But the veranda was a very interesting thing. It was a transition between the house and the garden. It was a place where you could have informal meetings and living. These are some of the earliest photographs taken in Australia. They're by Professor Smith of Sydney University from the 1850s. And we see probably Drummoyne House looking to the harbour with the family on the veranda, probably holding still for a very long time. And then a reverend gentleman and his wife on a rather sheltered veranda with lattice and plants, probably in the rocks. The hotel has been identified in the background. And so I think it's Lower Fort Street, in fact. And so the veranda was a special influence on Australian architecture throughout this period. Obviously, heating was a good deal easier. There was plentiful timber. Eventually, there was coal. And the fireplaces, primitive at first and lined with metal in a timber building. Quite often the kitchens, a separate structure. They were so anxious about, firstly, keeping the servants at a distance, but secondly, having the main fire source away from the main house and the family. And here's some pictures, a rather romantic view of the slab hut, a very improved slab hut, with the sort of gentleman with his writing board and his pipe and reading the paper while the fire is smouldering in a sort of semi-stone enclosure at the back of the timber building. And of course, on the right, a rather charming colonial view, really Devon or Cornwall transposed to the colonies. Very respectable sort of fireplace and grate. What's interesting about the 19th century and about the houses our ancestors lived in was that, in fact, it was a series of compartments in the house. Individual rooms linked by hallways. each room for a specific purpose. You could close that room and have your privacy, whether from the other members of the family or from the staff. Everything was compartmented. The idea of the open plan completely unknown in general terms, though occasionally big folding doors so you could connect rooms. It was a stratified society. The husband had his spaces, the wife also. Family public life was lived in a couple of formal rooms. Children had their quarters, possibly a nursery, and the staff were kept definitely behind a door somewhere so that they had their own residential quarters and kitchen areas and so forth. But I think you can see in this list there's quite a stratification and a compartmentalisation going on. And of course, in the 19th century, if you had means, the house was a wonderful vehicle of pretension. I don't know how many of you have seen those houses with the extraordinarily grand front, you know, what architects often refer to as the Queen Anne front and the Mary Anne back. And so that the statement of the street was terribly important. Whether you were in all buildings in the 19th century, what you said to the street was vital. And that should be as imposing as possible. And quite often, it's very interesting when you go to the old houses fronting Centennial Park, that there's all this verticality and pretension and big verandas. And sometimes you go inside and they're quite small, but the statement's there. And so you have the entrance hall as a statement, you have the facade as a statement, the grand staircase possibly, and big rooms with mirrors and imposing fireplaces or chimney pieces, and the book-lined study and so forth. And of course, a few portraits of the ancestors gave a bit of, status, and as many knickknacks as you could manage. They showed that you could afford a great deal. And so here we have a perfectly respectable house in Waverley, quite charming really, until you got inside. And I've always looked at this picture and thought, my God, what if you fell over? This is the sort of ultimate, connoisseurship of the worst kind, I suspect. But this is taking it to excess. But it's not untypical. Perhaps a bit more cluttered than usual. And a little bit later, these are from a wonderful book called Our Beautiful Homes, which is about 1910, and one of the best records of Sydney houses at the time. And this is a more architectural house. It's in Glebe Point Road still. It's called Hertford. It was built for an American dentist. American dentistry was the best in the world, so he was out here spruiking his skills. And he could build a grand house in Glebe Point Road, quite organised, rather American in fashion. And the interior, although it's slightly simpler and slightly more spacious, and the furniture's got a little bit more, perhaps elegant, is still chock full of stuff. Furnishing the house and how you expressed yourself was quite important. There's a fantastic wallpaper collection here at the Mint, which some of you might know about in the Caroline Simpson Library. And these are a wonderful scheme on the left by an English-trained architect, Wardell, who did Government House, Melbourne. Very sophisticated building, in fact. And on the right, I don't know if it ever happened, but this is a wonderful curtain scheme from a DJ's early catalogue. So whether it ever took place, I don't know, but it's what the decorator thought DJs should be selling. As the 19th and early 20th century move along, there starts to be services and equipment of the kind we understand. Gas comes in for lighting and for heating and for cooking. And in the Edwardian period, many of the things which we now just take as being accepted a century ago come into place, particularly for those in the slightly wealthier could afford the new gadgets. And so town water and sewerage comes in, actually really very importantly, to make sure there wasn't going to be plague and there'd be proper hygiene, so that we get the Prospect Reservoir and water supply coming into Sydney so that people aren't relying on wells. And we get the sewer system coming in because actually the clean water and sewerage are vital for the health of the modern city. And obviously there's electricity. We've got the telephone introduced, and the other thing that starts to happen is that increasingly the more affluents have cars, and there's mobility of a kind between the house and the shops, public transport less dependent on, and so forth. Here at Government House, Sydney, this interior is pretty well intact. The furniture's been varied a bit, but the room's still there. And the first grand gasoliers in Sydney. So gas lighting, oh, this is interesting. And of course, the evolution of the kitchen. This is Monsieur Neuflard's house in Sydney from about the 1850s. A range set into the wall of a kitchen, a cast iron range, possibly American. And on the right, Melbourne's company promoting its super duper gas stoves, where in fact the gas turned off when you lift the pots off the stove. It was sort of automatic on and off, which was pretty exciting, I think, for probably 1890. And of course, the sewer system and its results. These are the gentlemen in Melbourne, in fact, who are out there digging the trenches to get all the sewer system in. And you can see their equipment up on top of the building. And of course, on the right, the important resulting thing, you could bring the lavatory inside and you could buy the deluge washdown, which sounds pretty good. And of course, they liked those water containers high up so there could be the most incredible rush of water. As we turn to the 20th century, the Federation House is very interesting because at that time, construction techniques reached an advanced state. We got damp-proof courses so we could stop the damp coming up from the ground. We got cavity wall brick cavity construction so that we could actually have dry inside walls and damp outside walls. There's a sort of gap between in the two courses of brickwork. And we got wonderful, robust bricks, the best timber, goods we knew about, good stone, and we got Marseille tiles and slate to a high standard. And it's very interesting. If you go and look at the best Federation houses around Sydney that are still with us and intact, in places like Chatswood or Burwood, they're probably built to last 300 years, given a few coats of paint. They really are very, very fine houses in construction terms. So here's a very good example from the cover of Trevor Howell's book on the Federation House. And you can see the excellent materials that this photograph probably taken, 15 years ago, but showing the sort of, with a regular application of paint to the joinery, a very, very sound house. And although the picture on the right is a bit earlier, it's actually a late 19th century picture from Melbourne by one of the Boyd family, the idea of big sheets of glass and the light coming in and bay windows and inside-outside is something that starts to come into fashion and possibility by the 1890s. By the 20s, it's quite interesting because architecture, which has been all over the place in the 19th century, between 1830 or 1900, you know, they're all grasping at different styles and eccentric ideas to some extent. By the 1920s, a great discipline has appeared, and there's a belief in a simpler architecture, probably Georgian or Mediterranean-based, and people like Hardy Wilson in Sydney and Professor Wilkinson in Sydney were advocates of this style. I mean, it's countered by other styles to some extent, but you do see a very, very strong influence coming in of a greater discipline to architecture and planning. And of course, a greater acceptance of the landscape at that time. You know, they would accept the rock shelves and the folds of the land. They weren't trying to sort of terrace everything. And so native trees and root crops were accepted to some extent. But it's also important to realise that after World War I, we were paying off the war debt. There were very lean times. And of course, in the 30s, there was Great Depression. So a lot of the houses are fairly compact. The rooms are smallish, and the art and objects put in them are actually smaller. And it's interesting because the pictures from that side, unless you were a hotel or a club, the pictures are all very small and manageable from that period, with a few exceptions. And this gives you the sort of taste of the period. Errol Dean by Hardy Wilson on the left, a rather beautifully articulated veranda, a place where in fact a lot of the life of this house was lived, where tea was always taken. And then on the right, Professor Wilkinson's house at Vaucluse, with a wonderful loggia on the back of the house with a vaulted roof, and a reminiscence of earlier times in the interior of the Georgian period. We move to more modern times and experimentation with new materials and new ideas. Steel columns and beams allowed you big spaces and big openings inside and outside. Corner windows, something advocated by Frank Lloyd Wright but gradually introduced throughout the world in the 20th century. And through bituminized roofing, it often failed, Malfoy and other products, you can have flat roofs and gardens and terraces on the rooftop. And you get, in this period, a streamlining of architecture. It's a streamlining of cars and ships and planes, and it translates into architecture. And of course, it's a period when we suddenly decided we did want to let the sun in, and we did want to go to white or soft-coloured finishes. And so these are some interesting pictures. One of the earliest flat-roofed houses in Melbourne on the left, a house by G. Sidney Jones at Beecroft from 1915 in the middle picture, with you can quite clearly see the pavilion and pergola on the roof. And finally on the right, a number of houses in Neutral Bay had this third level as a terrace where you could have garden furniture and pot plants. And this is quite an interesting house, a slightly eccentric house called Craig End at the end of Darling Point Road. It was built to be the most modern house in Sydney at the time, though the owner took a quick trip to East Africa and decided he'd have to have some African details and a copper dome. So there's sort of slight contradictions at the 11th hour. But I think you can see in the picture on the left what the architect intended. It was the American consulate for many years, now in private hands, I understand. And so wonderful curving forms, corner windows, turrets and spiral staircases. Quite an intriguing house, in fact. The modern movement came in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and it wanted to have no historic references if possible. All of history should be, I was at university in the 60s, all of history should be swept aside. There was nothing good about the old. If you didn't believe in Corbyn, Mies van der Rohe, you were wrong. And so it's a very strong sort of advocacy where, in fact, all the city should be torn down and replaced by perfect buildings in park settings. Well, I think we're slightly glad that it didn't quite go that way, but nonetheless, it was a great push. And there were lots of possible structural possibilities coming forward. Excuse me. I'll get a glass of water. And all of a sudden, it was possible to have an open planning, and people were starting to understand what it might achieve for them. One large living space where you might have the kitchen and the eating and the living was starting to come into view. Large windows, occasional skylights, sparer furniture, modern furniture, but sparely placed because you now had lots of built-in cupboards. You could actually put the complex knickknacks and records in a cupboard. And of course, gradually, although it might seem high-tech to us, what they deemed to be high-tech kitchens, laundries and bathrooms with expensive fitments. Now, what have I done? No, here we go, I think. I don't seem to be progressing. Oh, wrong. I'm sorry, I've got it now. Thanks. And of course, Harry Zyder arrived here. He'd trained mainly in Canada in the northeast of the USA, particularly with Walter Gropius. He'd then gone to he'd gone to Rio and worked for Nemaya there. And he was out here to see his parents. I think he thought he would rush back to North America as quickly as possible. His mother had been here for a few years, and his parents, they had a bit of money, and he said, I think as a sort of bribe to keep him here, they said, oh, design us a house. So he did this house, which now belongs to this organisation and is open to view from time to time. He designed this house for his parents, which was designed in 1948 and finished in 1950. And It's a rather radical house for the time. I think it was alarming and shocking to the people who are used to pitched roofs and little windows and Georgian shutters, I suppose. And really it's a tribute to Gropius. He actually took Gropius here in the early 50s, and there are lots of... Harry tried to pose Gropius in every possible position with him speaking to him, and Baxter Bain was there to record the moment. And so Harry did this house, which is very much, I've brought the best of North America to you in Australia who don't really understand and need to be educated. And he designed the mural there. Because I find this interesting because the other houses in the period designed by Australian architects probably deserve, in my mind, greater attention. And on the left, a house by Arthur Baldwinson, much more nestled into the landscape, much more at ease with its positioning. And on the right, an interior by Sidney Anker from 1956 of a Japanese-inspired open-plan house with virtually no doors. I think there were doors into the bathrooms, but everything else was curtains and round the corner, as it were. Certainly was for a couple with one child. So that these were, I think, the freshest statements of the 1950s that led through to modern architecture as we know it, although I suppose it's gone in many directions since then. But this was a sort of high point of modern architecture being introduced to Sydney. Finally, where do we go to from here? A lot of architecture is still 18th century mud pies. You've probably seen the people stirring the cement in the backyard. And there is a question about whether that's the future. Possibly a lot of components, bathrooms and kitchens, things are starting to be made in the factory and brought to the site. And it's probably that a lot of, and steg bar windows and so forth, a lot of the components will be factory made rather than some rustic on the site stirring the cement or shaving the timber back. And of course, we all hope that, you never quite know with the modern manufacturers, but we all hope that we're heading towards high performance equipment that actually lasts, as opposed to the fridges which are guaranteed to conk out in 5 years, and also the finishes that do survive very well. So that I think there are modern finishes like Caesar stone which are heading in that direction. But in essence, that gives you a quick sort of capsule on the house and how it's evolved, and it's obviously changing. We've just been through a period really from 1990 to 2008 of extraordinary affluence, but nobody has yet quite recorded the outcome of those 18 years of opportunity for architects and designers and landscapers. So thank you. There'll be questions, I think, after the next talk. Thank you very much. Oh, I've gone somewhere. I don't think I'm supposed to have gone. Never mind.
Thank you very much, Howard. I think you've given us a really great primer and outline as we begin to look at each of the rooms in detail over the next 7 series. We'll be able to sort of see what the external factors are that are impacting on why rooms are larger and smaller over particular periods, and the kinds of exigent things that actually shape our rooms that aren't so much about how we might want to live, but the kind of things that are going on that are much broader. And that will be a really fantastic foundation. We're moving now from the sort of external factors around how the outside of a house shapes the inside of a house, and how things like shelter and compartments and the sort of the technology and mechanics of architecture impact on our housing, to the internal life of our houses and the very kind of personal nature and ways that people understand homes. And to take us through that, Rebecca Huntley will be speaking for us. And Rebecca is a researcher and author with a background in publishing, academia and politics. She holds a degree in law and film studies, and she also has a PhD in gender studies. She's the director of the Ipsos research project, and she's the author of 3 books, as well as being a feature writer for Vogue Australia and a columnist for BRW, and she is a much sought-after commentator on social trends. You may have seen her recently commentating the election, and I think she's putting paid to that with Q&A next Monday, but she's taking a welcome break from talking about Australian politics to come and talk to us about one of her most recent research projects, which is talking to Australians about their attitudes towards homes. Thanks, Rebecca.
Good evening, everyone. I have to tell you that in my early 20s, Dr Sophie Lieberman and I lived together in an apartment, and I could give you a half-hour presentation about what happened in that apartment, but I'm not going to. I'm actually going to tell you about how Australians today feel about their homes. So, is it better to do it that way? Yes, okay. So I want to tell you, before I explore with you a little bit about how Australians feel about their homes, I want to tell you about the way that we do our research. It's different than the normal kinds of focus group research that you might have read about or perhaps one day experienced yourself. You might have actually sat in a focus group. We do our research quite differently. We bring together a group of people who know each other very well. They're a friendship group, the same age and the same gender. The reason why it's so useful to talk to you tonight and so relevant is that we conduct those groups in people's homes. So when we conducted the research about how people feel about their homes, we're actually in their homes themselves, sitting in their lounge rooms, in their backyards, in their kitchens, in their sheds and various other places. So it gave us a bit of an insight into how people live, and in fact that's how we conduct our research. I've been to hundreds of homes across Australia over the last 8 years of being the director of the Ipsos Mind and Mood report. And the third element of the way we do our research is that it's undirected. We don't tend to come with a series of very specific questions. We don't say, how do you feel about your lounge room, or would you like some space in your home which was tidy or free of kids, or any of those kinds of things. We really say to people, we're doing a report about your home, tell us about it. And we allow their natural rapport, the natural relationship that exists in the friendship group to really guide the discussion. So it's very much a fly on the wall kind of form of research, and quite different to normal qualitative research in that way. So let me tell you a little bit about the findings of that study. There's absolutely no doubt that Australians consider the home, their personal space, to be the cornerstone of Australian life. Except for the beach and perhaps the park, Australians don't generally feel like public spaces are spaces that they feel that they can relax in as much as they can relax in their own home. I think it's one of the reasons why, as affluence has increased, people's homes have got bigger rather than necessarily more sophisticated. This idea of wanting to have more and more space, a media room, a guest room, very large rooms for each of our children. I think that's very much part of it. I also think the fact that Australia remains one of the home-owning democracies where home prices weren't hit significantly by the global financial crisis has meant that the home as the cornerstone of Australian life has remained. In places like Canada and the US, in Ireland in particular, and even in the UK, house prices took a hit. In Australia, there was a little bit of a flattening of the market, but in most places, Australians feel like the money that they invest in their home will be money returned to them. Most Australians, the vast majority, feel that their house that they live in for the majority of their life will be their greatest investment. It's their superannuation plan, it's their inheritance to their children. It's invested with an enormous amount of significance at a whole range of levels. And as a result, Australians are world-class complainers. Where every time I'm in Australian homes every 7 weeks, listening to them complain. And every now and then you choose a topic in which they almost don't complain, and they're incredibly positive, and this was one of those topics. Home ownership remains a powerful symbol of success, security, peace, and it seems to be a reflection of our personalities. This is why, despite the fact that Australian homes are so expensive, it's so expensive to buy a house, young Australians still see that home ownership is a goal that they want to pursue, despite the fact that it seems a goal that they will only get when their parents cark it. As one young man put it in one group that I conducted, he said, I'm headed towards home ownership. My parents' corpses are a road bump on that, on that road towards home ownership, which is that I will drive over them to get to the home that I need. But despite the fact that you need your parents to die or you need to win the lottery, most young Australians still want to own their own home because it's remained, as I said, a powerful symbol of success, security and peace. You can read some of the quotes that are in those boxes a little bit about what people say about their homes. This whole idea that the home should match your personality, nothing new about that at all, but still a very strong feeling amongst people. I referred to this a little bit more about the extent to which Australians see their house as probably their most important investment. And again, this has been particularly the case since the global financial crisis, in which people feel that the market remains a particularly volatile place. They've seen their superannuation funds decrease. And that, in fact, kind of re-emphasised the value that people might put in their homes. That being said, everybody felt that in the end, you don't have necessarily a kind of a functional or objective decision about when you buy a house that you might live in. You buy a lifestyle, you buy that emotional connection as much as you buy an investment. I think the thing that's interesting generally when you talk to different, and this is one of the benefits, I think, of doing groups, men and women separately, is that you see some of the differences about the way men talk about their home, which is, for them, it tends to be a pure refuge, unless they've got a particularly insistent wife about asking them to do X, Y and Z. I think what's noticeable when you talk to women is that whilst they love their homes and there's still a lot of positivity about it, they often talk about the need to escape the home to work. It's one of the benefits of being a working mother, is that at least at work I don't have 6 or 7 things that bother me that I have to get done. But at home I can see all the things that are dirty, all the things that need to be dealt with. And so to some extent there is a kind of a bit of a gender divide in terms of how people see the house and whether they see it as a place of pure refuge. The other thing you notice too is the extent to which, and this is significant as well given the single person household remains the fastest growing household type in Australia for a range of reasons. I mean, you talk to singles, young, old, regardless of whether they're single by choice, they've recently been divorced, recently been widowed, there's this sense that it can actually be quite lonely being in your house and in a house on your own, and sometimes the house becomes a pit stop. They often feel that if they are in the home on their own, they might eat not in the kitchen but in front of the television, or they might retreat to their own bedroom. So there's an interesting kind of conflict in terms of how singles feel about their own home. Except I often find women who've had lots of children who are divorced who actually love having a house and having nobody in it. And and in fact, when you talk to women with children, lots of children, particularly young children, they say that the time that they're most happy is when nobody else is in the house but themselves, and to have that peace and quiet is so important. I think one of the things that's clear is that for families with children, there's this sense that the home has to be everything. It has to be a place where you entertain friends, a place where you entertain your children. So it becomes invested in so much. And you can see this in the extent to which children's toys seem to colonise every single part of most of the homes that I've ever been in. I can't tell you the amount of time I've sat on some electric toy or some kind of Lego on a couch. I've seen them in toilets, I've seen them in kitchens, they're everywhere. And there's this kind of sense that once you have children, they spill everywhere. And it was interesting listening to Howard's talk about this whole idea of when the home was a place that was compartmentalised. You know, there was different spaces for different people. You know, there was formal spaces and informal spaces. And I think it's a reflection of just how obsessed we are with children and how child-centric we are, and I think there are good and bad things about that. The extent to which the home is seen by parents as a place where children should go everywhere. Children should be everywhere. There should be children's toys in my bedroom, in every part of the house, and that you need to turn the house into a place that is absolutely focused on the child, and you see that, you know, a lot. The other thing I think is interesting, you know, I often get asked a lot about the baby boomers and what they're going to do with their homes and when are they going to downsize. And I tend to find with baby boomers that there is very much a sense that they want to remain in the houses in which they've raised their children for various reasons. I think there's, you know, I'm not going to go into the complex psychological reasons why I think that's the case, but one of the things I have noticed, particularly amongst empty nesters, is the excitement about recreating the home after children have left as a creative space. So suddenly, you know, John's left at the age of 27, and in order to stop him coming back, we're going to turn his room into a gym or into a craft room or into a place with a lot of heavy industrial machinery that he can never return. So, I mean, interestingly, there's lots of ways to stop your adult children returning to your home. One of them is to sell the home and downsize so that you only have, you know, 2 bedrooms. The other is to completely change the rooms that they lived in to reflect your new interests and your new ideas. So the interesting thing we found in this research is the extent to which empty nesters and baby boomers were throwing themselves into the idea of remaking their family homes to reflect this new stage of life, which was active and which was about personal interests and hobbies that they weren't able to pursue as much when they had dependent children. There's no doubt, and this again reinforces the point that I made about the extent to which Australians are still very connected to the idea of home ownership, is that when we talk to renters, there was absolutely no sense of the same connection to their home than people who owned their home. They didn't really like the houses they were in the same way, even though those houses were perfectly fine. There was a sense of being there temporarily, and this was the case even for renters who'd been in their homes for 3 or 4 or 5 years. What's the point of doing this up, or what's the point of having a thinking about this room, or doing any of those other kinds of things? This always makes me think that, you know, this relationship to the rented home is not the case in other cultures. We need to think about how we change that. It's awful to think, particularly if you see how expensive the market is across Australia, that people who would rent their home would have that sense that they don't really belong there and that they can't have that sense of ownership and connection. It has to be a way that we can kind of transform this. I'm sure there's things that we can do in terms of legal reform, but there must be other reforms as well. I want to talk a little bit now, because Howard gave you that wonderful history of the different kinds of rooms and how they functioned and the influences on how they developed. I want to talk a little bit about some of the features and how people feel about what are the important features that they should have in their home. There's been a big discussion in our groups about size. Does it matter or not in relation to houses? There is a real recognition amongst Australians that houses are getting bigger as we become more affluent, and ironically as our families get smaller. People don't want that. They see that as contributing to urban sprawl. But when it comes down to it, people want other people to buy small houses, and I want to buy a large house where I can have my media room and my 6 bedrooms. But I also think there's a very strong sense, and you know, it's very difficult to dislodge this, that Australians think that you can't live a full life in an apartment. I've had lots and lots of people in groups say to me, oh, an apartment's all very well and good. When you have a child, you can't possibly raise a child in an apartment, despite the fact that millions of children all over the world are raised perfectly fine in apartments. In fact, I had one young man in a group that I conducted in Kirribilli said that if we raised children in apartments, they would all become fat retards. It's a very kind of strong way of putting it. But we've had similar things said to me. There's a block amongst Australians about the idea that you can't live an interesting and full life in an apartment, especially if you're a family. This is in conflict to the fact that people want their urban centres to be better planned. They don't want urban sprawl. They want to be able to make sure that we manage our populations and house them in a way that doesn't create kind of ugly buildings and doesn't stretch cities beyond the capacity to provide infrastructure. So this is a real tension. I can't see at any time that being resolved between people knowing that we should be living in smaller and better built houses, but not wanting them for themselves. That being said, in the research that we did for people who had large homes, there was a sense of they require an enormous amount of maintenance and cleaning. And having a particularly large home, particularly if you can't afford somebody to clean it, is not the greatest idea. One of the things that is interesting, and we've seen this in a number of different research reports that we've done, including one on Australian identity, is that, well, look, no, it would be nice to have a large backyard or a garden, but it's really not going to happen. We're going to have to deal with smaller spaces. But we want some kind of green space, enough for a barbecue and to be able to have the kids wander around a bit and to be able to have some friends over. That's really all we need. So this kind of acceptance that backyards are getting smaller, but they still remain valued for people. And I think this is, again, one of the reasons why people associate apartment living with not necessarily kind of healthy living. If you don't have a backyard, then it's those patios, decks and balconies that become extremely important. And in fact, for those people who have large enough outdoor spaces and creative spaces, they can be used quite well. So we've seen that in the kind of resurgent interest in balcony gardens and urban gardening, which is something that comes up quite a lot in our research. I was very interested to hear Howard talk about this idea of the compartmentalised house, where there was a space where the father might sit, or in the study, smoking a pipe, and the mother might have her space, and so forth. Of course, we've seen a relentless drive towards open and more informal living, and that's been reflected in the architecture of the everyday house. But it's interesting because even though people like that idea of informal living, there is still a real sense that people want a retreat within their retreat. And in many ways, there's a kind of gender skew to this. We had a lot in this research about men and their sheds. There was a lot of discussion. I love this particular quote, "The house, that's where the family goes while you're in the shed." This man had the most extraordinary shed I've ever seen. There were 3 televisions in this shed. There was a large fridge. There was a couch. Many of his best friends had never walked into his house. They had only ever gone straight to the shed. The wife brought the food out to the shed. They had a kind of a walkie-talkie system for her to bring food out. In fact, I wonder whether they had a functional marriage, because he was completely obsessed with this shed and he just did not want to go into the family home much except to sleep. But really this is kind of idea about that the shed is a place that, and this may in fact be a reaction, perhaps a kind of a subconscious reaction to the extent to which the family home has now become the space where there's a million toys spread everywhere. That the men have retreated to the shed as a response to that. For women, there was very much a sense that they wanted one little corner of the house. It didn't have to be very big, which was toy-free and kid-free. And for them, it was less about socialising with friends, although that was sometimes talked about, but it was really about time alone. One woman, it's not here in this quote, she said, "I really want a corner of the house that's completely tidy at all times. There's no toys. I can sit there with my glass of wine and nobody will touch me." She literally said, "I don't want anybody, because all day I've got people touching me and it's just a place where no one will touch me." So I think that this idea of a little space in the house, which is a retreat, not necessarily because people want formality, but people feel that they need individual space and a sense to reclaim individuality. And I think escaping from children's toys is a big part of this. So again, this whole idea of informal living, the lounge room, kitchen, TV room is the trifecta for most people. This one big living space, you don't need a formal dining room, and in fact, one shouldn't believe food media and think that everybody's out there doing a lot of formal dining and having a lot of dinner parties and needing formal dining areas. In fact, the house was seen as primarily a place that facilitated informal dining. So the dinner party scene is really not as extensive as you think. And in fact, most people really wanted a broader area potentially that could then move out towards a barbecue in which children, family, friends could move in and out, everybody could be seen to facilitate that kind of ease of walking around with food and so forth. And, you know, what we see continuously, even in these, what I've observed as well, continuously in these kinds of large living spaces, is even the informal kitchen table not being used as much and becoming, as this woman said, a storage area. At least part of the kitchen table has papers, is where children do homework and so forth. So there might be a very kind of a different kind of relationship with the kitchen table, with the dining table than previously. The other thing we get a lot in our research is this idea of how do I protect my home, how do I protect my property, and how do I protect the people in it. And wanting to, this is a very funny quote, natural barbed wire, I think that's very good. And, you know, I have been to some houses in which I've thought, my gosh, there must be kind of, you know, extraordinary antique furniture or a Matisse in here because there's kind of, you know, dogs and barbed wire and all kind of big fences, and, you know, there is security, and you come in and there's just a completely normal house. But some people are really quite scared, and this kind of idea of how you secure your home. And I have found that this has almost got nothing to do with the crime rate in the suburb, in which people are being paranoid about security. In fact, some of the most paranoid people about security live in, you know, reasonably safe environments. But I mean, in terms of walking around, you kind of think, I can't see this as a place that would be very problematic. But this kind of idea of building high fences and gates to keep people out, again, the big theme in our research. In terms of what people do in their home, this kind of idea of it being a relaxed place, a place where you just retreat and chill out, and do the kinds of things that you know, having a bath, reading, listening to music. People don't necessarily see their home as a particularly dynamic place, and when they do entertain, it tends to be quite informal. But again, for women, it's also a place where there's endless things to do as well, which is probably why the flip side of wanting to be relaxed when you're there, that, you know, especially on the weekend, there's this never-ending list of household chores, some feeling quite overwhelmed by maintenance jobs. And whilst there's excited renovators out there, there's as many people whose husbands have started renovation projects and will never, ever finish them. The other thing I think too, and this is very much the case, we've seen the demise of the formal dining room, is that, you know, people are interested in casual entertaining, that outside and inside space. And again, I think there's this idea, and this is the extent to which the child's centric nature of particularly families and how they focus on this has really led this. And, you know, it's interesting when people talk about formal dining spaces and dinner parties. And one of the groups that we conducted of women in their late 20s with primary school aged kids, one woman said, I can't imagine how you even have a formal dinner party with children. Like, when do you prepare that meal, you know, and how do you manage it? So there's these kinds of mental blocks about the idea that when you have children that you could use those kinds of formal spaces, and even if you had them, they'd become colonised by papers and other things, and that you could use that space in a different way. The other thing I think is interesting too, and we're going to see this happen more and more as technology becomes more sophisticated, as workplaces become more flexible in terms of where people work, is the home being a place of paid work and study, and also a place in which digital technology is constantly on and connecting you to the world of work. This is another thing, along with the list of uncompleted chores, that is, an incursion into the sanctuary of the home. This sense of I might be sitting there, it might be a Thursday night, I might be having a glass of wine, watching television, but I've got my iPhone or my tablet in my hand. And in fact, around 60 to 70% of Australians do what we call multi-screening if they're watching television. They have access to another screen at the same time. And there's work emails coming in, or there's something else kind of popping up. So this sense of not being able to escape your life while in your home because of technology, but also this idea that home would be a place where you might do some paid work. And so I think one of the things that's going to happen as the home evolves is we're going to see some of those compartments coming back, and one of them will be interesting and useful ways to think about the home office, as well as people, certainly in certain professions, need to work from home but want some sense of removal from work and where they relax. So that's it. I think it's time now for Howard and I to field your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was fascinating. For those of you who are staying for questions, we have microphones. If you could look out for Claire and Terry and speak to them, that would be useful, so that people can, we can record this and those who are at home can hear your questions as well as the answers. So a call for questions. And my father puts his hand up.
I can't tell you about what Sophie and I did.
Thank you, Rebecca.
This is really a question for both of you. If you go to a place like Alexandria, there are hundreds of new apartments going up, and they seem to be getting increasingly smaller. And my experience of many apartments is that they're poorly constructed. They look quite nice, but the water comes in through the roof, and you can hear if somebody coughs in one apartment, three apartments away, you hear it, or flushes the toilet. And do you think there's going to be a problem with that sort of quality? You mentioned quality buildings, but I wonder whether that's what we're actually getting. So it's really the lifestyle and then the quality of the buildings.
Well, certainly Clover Moore has been a bit anxious about the state government controls for that area that put enormous density into that part of Sydney. And in a way, the city is now extending to the airport through that zone. We do have various controls that encourage cross-ventilation, natural light, and decks or balconies that are at least 2.5 metres wide, so that there are some useful controls in place, and I think also noise between apartments is determined through that code. Others here probably know it better than I, but there are various ways that they've controlled apartment design in New South Wales ahead of other states. So that's good, but there is always this question about whether those areas in 25 years' time are going to be attractive and valued. I think that's the anxiety I have.
Yeah, I mean, my only reflection on that is that I do worry when these apartment blocks go up and there's a word of mouth is that they're badly constructed, is that just reinforces this idea that apartment living can't be good living. And then people say, I don't want to live in some awful shoddy box where, I can hear the people down the hall, doing what they're doing. And so this kind of idea that's the prototype for apartment living rather than some other kind of living. And we certainly need to get density right. And the other thing, of course, that happens, and this is where I think, we get some racist assumptions that the people who live in those apartments are people from cultures who are used to living kind of cheek to jowl, in which case that's not what Australians do. People will say Australians don't live in apartments. Australians live in apartments for short periods of time, they invest in them, and then they move into houses. And there's still some very entrenched views about apartment living vis-a-vis living in houses that I don't think are helped when we see these kinds of less than ideal complexes.
Further questions? Michael?
Howard, could you just explore the idea of prefabricated buildings a bit more? I mean, that's got all sorts of negativity, which Rebecca may want to comment on. But when you see a Chinese 30-floor building going up in 30 days, that's sort of one dream, and you might say, well, that's just for the Chinese, it wouldn't work for us. But the idea that a modern house is really like having a bespoke piece of clothing that's made by a tailor, and what you really should be doing is buying it off the rack and it's made somewhere else. How do you see that all developing, and what might be the impact on timings and costs and things like that?
Well, look, there always will be a bespoke market, but it'll always be an expensive market. And I suppose we've seen in the last while IKEA providing kitchens, with a quick granite bench top that are actually to a good, affordable standard and a reasonable standard. And we also see, I know in New Zealand hotels, the bathrooms are usually prefabricated and brought to the site. So the whole bathroom arrives in a sort of bubble wrap and is put into place and works. The dullness is, I suppose, if it all became completely uniform. I mean, everybody's longing for some degree of individuality in the fitments or the colours or whatever, but I think that's possible. And I just think that increasingly, to speed up the process, we are going to have elements prefabricated, but hopefully with enough variety that we don't get, well, if you've ever been to the Soviet Union, the identical apartment block going forever and not terribly well designed.
Yep, just here, Terry. Thank you.
I have two unrelated questions. First to Howard. What do you think is the Australian style? Has Glenn Murcutt got it? And to Rebecca, I seem to have become a bad parent because both my children, one's 32 and married, was adamant that he wanted to live in Enmore. We live in Tarramara in a 5-bedroom house with a huge garden and all that. So they went completely away from that. He wanted to put artificial grass in his small courtyard, doesn't want to do any gardening. And my other son, 27, and his wife, and now a little baby, was adamant. They wanted to live in the city, and they now live in a Meriton high-rise. There was no way they could be convinced to live in a house with a garden just like ours. So where did we go wrong?
Like Howard, I don't think you went wrong at all. I mean, I think I could give a whole other presentation about the complexities amongst how different kinds of young Australians are responding to housing. The overall theme is I want to own property of some kind, and the general theme is if I have a child, I don't necessarily want to be in an apartment. That doesn't mean that I don't want to be I'm going to be in a massive house with, and of course the garden issue is all about spare time, about people. I don't want to spend my weekend worrying about a garden. I want to be out, if he's in Enmore, there's lots of fantastic places to go out and so forth. So I think there's been some accommodation amongst young Australians to what the Australian dream might look for them, like for them, and a lot of flexibility. I mean, we did another study about how young Australians feel about home ownership, and a lot of them were thinking about, my first house might be an apartment that I live in for a short period of time, and then I might move back in with my parents while I save to buy a larger home. So there's quite a lot of diversity about what people are doing in that generation. But the idea of being able to own property is still extremely important, and not to rent.
It's not you, it's them.
The Australian dream. If the Australian dream is that new house created in a paddock somewhere, and it's going to be at Picton along a densely clogged road, only accessible by car. This is why I think that change is afoot to some degree, and the idea of another 1 million people in Sydney, when you could actually put, if you put another 250,000 in Canberra and Newcastle, they'd probably be better places. Somebody might object to that. But so there's that aspect. Going to your first question, look, there's a great deal of diversity of what might be Australian style. And I suppose Glenn Murcutt focused the mind on a particular approach. All his houses, the ones you know, are all shown in glamorous landscape paddocks with big trees. which is not exactly how we live in Sydney. But there are many. I think there's a very healthy in Australia and New Zealand, young architects designing interesting houses. It's very prevalent, and I think you can see some exciting things there. A great diversity and a lot of talent, actually.
Yes, down the back here. Sorry, the check dress.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a comment with regards to what's been said that might throw some light for you to comment on. With regards to moving from the upper North Shore to the inner city, I've got some friends that have bought a huge house at Wahroonga, and these are late 20-year-olds. They've all pulled in together and bought a huge house, and they're renovating it into their own apartments within the house, and they're loving the gardening, they're loving the pool, they're loving the whole thing. So there is hope. The other point that I'd like to make is, in the 60s, I grew up with my artistic parents in the bohemian sector of Potts Point, overlooking the building of the city of Sydney. Then in the 70s, we moved to Paddington. We were the only Australian English-speaking people in the street. And the trendy Paddington was nowhere to be seen then. I've now been living for nearly 20 years in Redfern in an extremely smart walled city, a high-rise it was the first one to be designed. So I've seen, in a way, the gentrification of King's Cross becoming the cafe society as it is, and the bistros and everything. Paddington certainly changing immensely, and also with Redfern. And the point about living in apartments, I would love to host a research group in apartment living with professional people that have left houses. We have everything we need. In Paddington, I could hear the people next door. Now I can't. Across the driveway is equivalent to 2 or 3 streets in Paddington within the complex I live in. So depending on the design and the architecture, it really does make a huge difference. Thank you.
And this gentleman in the striped T-shirt, thank you.
You made a comment about renters not feeling the sense of ownership. Now this, I've never lived overseas. I understand that long-term leasehold tenure does work in other countries. How can we bring that sense of ownership, or individuals be able to own their internal space and that's my home, to Australia?
Yes, I think that we have to look at those models. You know, Howard would probably know more about this, but in Europe, where people have a lot more security of tenure, they have more kind of, they don't necessarily have to go and talk to the landlord every time they want to nail something into the wall and so forth. There's got to be another way of doing it. But generally, what renters in places in which they've been consistently low, good rental stock has been low and the prices have been high, is this sense of that they're living a kind of tentative existence about the landlord every 6 months or every year putting the rent up, or kind of, you know, turfing them out to do new things, you know, with the place. So there's a tentativeness that renters feel about the places that they live, and a sense too that they say rent money is dead money. They just kind of don't feel that it's being invested in any way. That there must be a way to change that. In a sense, what we've seen, and the lady who mentioned, had a long conversation before about those people in those 20s buying a large house and kind of creating living spaces within it. I think what you're seeing is as a consequence of the fact that the rental situation is so dire, people are doing very kind of creative and different things. It might be building a new level on their parents' house, or going in for investing into a place with a couple of friends or a brother or sister, or finding those kind of communal living opportunities. So no, there's models overseas that we need to think about introducing, but of course, politically, I don't know how useful that, how much that would be resisted.
I think there's also a pattern emerging. It certainly exists I've seen it in Turkey, and it exists in Britain now, where the government encourages a group of people to combine, because if 20 families combine, they can actually afford a better site, they can afford an architect, and they can gradually fund a better complex of housing. And the British government, I think, having seen other models, is now encouraging people to do that, because their buying power as a group of, say, 20 families is much more significant than as an individual.
Thank you very much. I think we'll close there. I'm conscious Rebecca has another engagement to get to, and a very important one at that. Please join me in thanking Rebecca and Howard for a really interesting and contrasting... we have another 7 in the series. Next week we will be talking about the dining room with our own Scott Hill and Dr Judith O'Callaghan from the University of New South Wales. I'm not sure if I shouldn't be calling it the dead room after, or the storage room, but we'll have a historical and a contemporary take on the dining room, and I sincerely hope that you can all join us. Thank you very much. Okay.